Welcome back to We Are Here. I am your host, Chase Levitt, and I'm really excited about today's episode. I am joined by Utah State Representative Phil Lyman. He represents District 69 down in southern Utah, Blanding area. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right, perfect. Phil, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with me.
Thank you, Chase.
Yeah, of course. So if you just want to take a minute and tell everyone who may not know you, kind of your background, who you are, what led you to running for the legislature, stuff like that.
Well, I've been in Utah my whole life, fifth generation Utahn, and care a lot about the state. Um, Born and raised in Blanding, Utah, which is way down in the southeast corner. It's right in the middle of a bunch of public land. I always say Blanding is a island of private property and an ocean of public land, and that for most people is a good thing when you can go out and you know enjoy the outdoors, enjoy the land. But as they start to, limit your access to do extraction or logging or grazing, and then pretty soon they say, we really don't want tourism on there either. We don't want recreation. And then they start trespassing people for going on public land. Then it starts to have a whole different feel. You feel like you're instead of having all the freedoms that come with public land, you have the kind of a prisoner on private property, and the federal government that was never supposed to own all of the state of Utah in the first place uh, is now calling the shots, and their law enforcement and regulations and all those things. So that's kind of the environment that I grew up in. And I tell people now, whether you're talking about public lands or public schools or public health, do you really want the federal government dictating the terms of our republic and what is supposed to be government by the people and for the people now is becoming more and more government by unelected bureaucracies and federal agencies. So it's a big deal. Anyway, and so I was county commissioner for 8 years, ran for the state legislature. Uh, I've been in the legislature now for 4.5 years, and currently I in a run for the governor office. So
Yeah, that's awesome. And thank you for all you do. I see all that you're doing in the legislature, and you're working for the people. I want to ask you, what do you feel like is what's the word I'm looking for? Your biggest success in the legislature? Like, what is the thing that you're most proud of that you've accomplished?
well, I passed a bill early on, um, right after President Biden was elected. We passed a bill that said executive orders. It's HB 415 in 2021. Said if the state determines that executive orders are not constitutional, then the state agencies will be prohibited from implementing those executive orders or acting upon them. And of course, that was right about the time he had designated the Bears National Monument, expanded it. Trump got in and reduced it, and then President Biden got in and expanded it. And that's a big one. And there's a lot of executive orders. What used to be congressional laws now has turned into agency rulemaking and executive orders. So that was a big one. The first bill I passed said that you couldn't drag debris across a legal road, and if you did, it was going to be a misdemeanor. And the BLM does that all the time, and environmentalist groups do that all the time. And so that raised a lot of um, you know pushback from those groups. In fact, the BLM said, "Are you going to arrest BLM people?" And we said, "Well, there's 99 ways to close a road correctly, and really one way to do it incorrectly. So don't do it that way. Just go through the right process." So I think I ran a bill to censure Mitt Romney because he voted to impeach Donald Trump, and I don't care how you feel about Donald Trump. He's the leader of the Republican Party, and if you're the Republican senator from Utah, you shouldn't do things like that. So those are a few things that I'm proud of. There's a lot more.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you. So you mentioned, you're exploring a run for governor. We currently have a governor who has disappointed a lot of people, including me. He's been weak on many issues. One in particular that that's important to me is keeping, basically men out of women's sports. And he decided to veto that. Luckily, it was overridden by the legislature, but he stuff like that, and I call him governor pronouns or governor he him because he feels the need to let us know his pronouns. So what I want to know is what made you decide to explore run for governor?
Well, some of those things that you mentioned, just things that it's like it's so far out of touch, and with who the people of Utah really are and what they value, and not that we don't care about, transgender kids, we do. It's just when you see something like Riley Gaines, who I'm hopefully will be out here with me in a little while. When you see her, having to give up her fifth place trophy to a dude that beat her in swimming, is like, that's not right. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And people deserve a fair shot. And they'll work for it. To have a fair fight and lose, most people are okay with that.
Right,
But when the scales are tipped against them, and they can see that government is not for them but actually against them, that very instrument that was supposed to protect our liberty is being used to take it away.
right,
Uh, so those things in the legislature really became very, very apparent to me. And then also just the way decisions are made between the leadership and the governor and some of the wealthy people in Utah and the lobbyists. And it's like, that's not the way legislation is supposed to be done in a Republican form of government. It's by representatives of the people, and too often it's top down, heavy handed coercion, money, and Utah should be doing better than that. There's a group that does fraud index, and they gave Utah, an F in judiciary accountability, an F in state civil service management, an F in lobbying disclosure, an F in ethics enforcement agencies, an F in state pension fund management, and an F in executive accountability, D minus overall. And that's, Utah doesn't need to do that. We can do so much better.
right, for sure. And it's so courageous for you to jump into this race because Spencer Cox, he's an incumbent. He's gonna have the money behind him. He's gonna have the establishment behind him. All those people with a lot of power. So I mean, I just want to thank you right now for even considering it because it's such a tough thing to do, and because we do need at this time in this country strong conservative leadership, not just Republican leadership. We need strong conservative leadership.
Well, and states are so important on the national front. The governor is the governor of the state of Utah, but he's also one of 50 governors in the country. And it's disappointing when you see the governor of Utah joining with five Democrat governors across the country to uh, bring the Conservation Corps to Utah, teaming up with Governor Newsom. And all through COVID, Governor Cox was lockstep with President Biden, and all the same talking points. And so the governor can make a big difference, not just in Utah, but nationally. And that's an opportunity in my book. It's an opportunity to maybe tip things a little bit, tip the scales a little bit in favor of liberty and in favor of the Constitution, and
Sure.
following that document that is supposed to bind leaders down.
For sure. Now I want to ask you what would you say are the top three things that you're going to run on?
So um, I call them the natural resources. That is probably one of the top things. So natural resources is the land, the minerals, and uh, just the everything that Utah has, the recreation asset. And right now, 67% of the state is owned by the federal government, which wouldn't be a bad thing if the federal government didn't exercise such jurisdiction. So those natural resources, Utah should be energy independent. There's no question. We have the ability to. We could provide energy for the entire West if we would unlock our reserves. Nuclear energy would be a fantastic development for the country, and Utah should be leading out on that. Emphasize that our natural gas and our coal reserves are important. Another area that I focus on is good governance. Coming back to that Republican form of government, and the Constitution guarantees every state a Republican form of government. That means you've got checks and balances, and you've got representative government by the people. Uh, the laws that are passed should be by the consent of the people, not done, kind of behind closed doors and then pushed through a really fast session or something like that. So the representative form of government, and then I guess and there's a few others, but maybe a third one would just be the infrastructure to improve Utah's infrastructure. You have a lot of water falls on Utah, and we divert about 6% of it, and it's all it's been agricultural people that have created the diversions for their agricultural operations, and then that's slowly been turned over to developing communities, which is fine, but we're not really developing new water sources, especially on the south end of the state. So reservoirs and ditches and pipelines, and then along with that is the power infrastructure to get power to some of the communities. And then transportation. We should build more roads and more bridges to places that where people could enjoy and potentially live. I'm always surprised when I see the high density housing on the Wasatch Front, and I don't know that people would just naturally want to live on top of each other. If you lived in a nice high rise apartment building, I could see maybe the appeal of that, but these massive developments of downtown high density housing, it seems short sighted to me. It seems like we ought to be using some of the land that's close to our cities, or even some often in closer to the rural places. Not that rural wants any of that, but Utah's got a lot of land, and we're building on top of each other. So I think the infrastructure is going to be really important. Yeah, and then you've got your social needs. I'm very tuned into like the homeless situation, which is a function of usually drug addiction or mental illness or both, some criminality that goes on there. And there's so much more we could do. I look at the homeless situation and I wonder who's facilitating that. It's not, again, that's not a natural condition, and society would take care of those people, but there's somebody that's providing the means for those people to remain on the streets, addicted to drugs, and we could fix that one too.
Right, for sure. Thank you. And something that's really important to me, being a high school senior, I just turned 18, so I'm still young and stuff, and being involved in politics, getting involved back when I was 14, is it's youth involvement in campaigns and like trying to set up our future and being involved and stuff like that. So what I want to ask you is, how will the youth be involved in your campaign? What are, do you believe that's a necessity? Stuff like that.
Well, I'll tell you, I look at the young people, and it seems like there's not a lot of gray area. They get it or they don't get it. And the ones that get it really get it. And they're not about to give away their rights. They're tuned in. They don't appreciate watching, the debt increase and the dysfunction of the country, especially in America. America is a place where we should be proud to grow up. We should be proud to be Americans. And when you see people who aren't proud to be Americans, when you see people uh, some of these world organizations that really want to kind of undermine the country. I mean, you take a company like Google. Nothing wrong with Google. They do a lot of really good things, but they don't care about America. They care about Google, and their policies and things sometimes undermine our society and promote things that cause more of division rather than unity. So um, I guess when it comes to the youth, the sooner the better. The sooner the better we can bring young people into that program, the better off we're going to be, because they are capable. And again, it seems to me like there's those that are interested that should have some responsibility, and those that aren't interested, that's fine. They can go do something different.
Right. And like you said, there's no gray area. It's super black and white. There's this big separation. And it was kind of funny because you see a bunch of Gen Z people are like, Gen Z doesn't care about America, stuff like this, which I don't believe is true. But there are instances. I was in my government class. It was one of the first weeks of school, and the teacher asked us, what country do you think is the best in the world? And then he said, who thinks America is the best? About only 70% of the class raised their hand, which is far too low, even though that seems like a high number. There were 30% who said no, which some of their reasons were they weren't educated enough to be making that decision. Some of them thought that we didn't have enough here, which made absolutely no sense to me. But so, that's what I'm trying to do is, kind of be that voice of like, we live in this great country. And so let's do our part to keep it great. So yeah. And the next question I have for you is, so a while ago when I first found out who you were and stuff like that, I saw a picture of your mugshot. That was one of the first pictures that I saw. I was like, huh, this is interesting. And so I kind of did some reading into it. So I want to ask you about that. And you were eventually pardoned by President Trump. And so tell me about that.
So I saw some stuff happen in my community that drew me into politics. One of them was when the BLM, that's Bureau of Land Management, where I come from, raided my town of Blanding, and it was a pretty harsh exercise, and it's unconstitutional what they did. It's not right, and I didn't see much of a pushback. So when I got into the county commission, I wanted answers. I wanted the BLM to tell us what was the damages that you're observing, what was the illegal activities that you're observing, and they couldn't. There was it was a fabricated exercise mainly to justify taking the Bears Ears National Monument and putting it into, taking away all of the um, extraction and things like that on the Bears Ears National Monument, which is very rich in oil and gas and uranium, all these things. So the government does, the conservation under the name of conservation, they take away things. At some point, we did a protest on that, perfectly legal protest, but because it was, um, I guess it's, maybe along the lines of like people just going into the canyon, into recapture canyon, saying, we want answers to this. So we stay on the road, we stay on the county road, we go down, we turn around, we come back out. 6 months later, because of some out outcries from people on the Wasatch Front, the U.S. attorney presses charges, and I get dragged into court. I told my wife, I said, "Don't worry about it. This is ridiculous. There's no crime." Well, you find out in federal court that doesn't make any difference. Whether you're innocent or not makes no difference. It's federal court for a reason, and so we go through this kangaroo court, get convicted. They wanted me to go to jail for 2 years. In the end, I got sentenced to 10 days, which was very real, 10 days. And and then when after President Trump lost the 2020 election, quote unquote, um, I thought, people had told me you can't get pardoned for a misdemeanor, and that's what mine was. So I thought that President Trump can pardon whoever he wants. So I contacted Senator Lee and Jason Chaffetz, friend of mine, and said, "Hey, would you guys write an affidavit and go along with my application?" And Senator Lee really picked up the torch on that and carried that through. And then yeah, I was in that first 17 that Trump pardoned, which was cool. I'd already done my jail time and paid you know, all my fines. I spent several $100,000 in court. So very painful, but I learned a lot from it. And and now I've got a mugshot. Before mugshots were cool. I have one. So
Yeah, for sure. I remember a couple weeks ago when Trump had his mugshot released, I saw your post on well, X, not Twitter, but of your mugshot compared to his, and I was like, man, this guy is cool. And so yeah, that's
yeah,
it's
I
a
did it last Christmas. I did a coffee mug with my mugshot on, and then a friend of mine who went to jail mainly because he's a friend of mine.
yeah,
At that same event, I made some mugs for him just before Christmas, and oh, he thought it was the coolest thing ever. So
that's awesome. You're gonna have
if you
to
have one, you might as well own it, I guess.
right. You're gonna have to get a t-shirt or something with you and Trump's mugshots next to each other.
Right
Yeah,
there you go.
I'd get
Yeah.
one right there. No questions.
And I mean, a mugshot isn't anything to necessarily be proud of on its own, but when you get a mugshot for standing up, that's something to be proud of. And I think that's what distinguishes me from a lot of other politicians. I hope people recognize that it's not just talk for me. I'll walk the walk. I'll be right out in front. And um, I, you hear politicians sometimes say, "Well, you got to pick your battles," and I always say, "Well, if you're telling the truth, the battles will find you," and that's what it's all about, is telling the truth and living the truth.
And we're at a time in this country where, having a mugshot for some of the things that you were charged for, and then now President Trump, it's a badge of honor almost. So
It is to me. Yeah.
standing up. That's super awesome, and it's inspirational for young people like me too, to look up to people like you and President Trump who are standing up for truth, for freedom, for liberty, and all of that. And speaking of President Trump, you are one of very few legislators right now that have endorsed him. Hopefully more follow. And but I want to ask you, just so everyone can hear, why are you supporting President Trump in 2024?
Well, I, I wouldn't just support him because I like him, which I do like him. A lot of people don't, but I support him because he has really fantastic policies, and he's the leader, in the Republican um, candidacy. He's way out in front, and I always say, you support your candidate, you support the person who's out front, and but yeah, I think President Trump did a great job on his policies in his first 4 years. Uh, and 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 for me, it gets a little bit more personal. He came and rescinded the Bears Ears National Monument, and that's in my backyard. I can see it from my back window, and so the fact that he did that, I think he would do that again if he's elected. Um, and the Grand Staircase National Monument, those things mean jobs for people in my towns and in the south end of the state. It means a lot for the whole state of Utah. So um, yeah, no reason for me not to. I can't see a reason why I would not fully endorse President Trump.
Right. I mean, he did so much for our country. And it's like whether people like him or not, like I have family members who don't necessarily love him personally, but they're like, we got to support him. You look what he did. You look at where we were 3 years ago to now, it's just completely declined. And so, I mean, President Trump is the obvious answer. Now, a lot of people will say there's Ron DeSantis, who's younger. He's a younger version of Trump, when in reality, I just don't think he has what it takes to be how President Trump was and be as firm and as strong as he was especially on the international stage. His foreign policy was phenomenal and all that. So, and that's why, for the same reasons you pointed out, why I decided that I'm going to be voting for President Trump, because I'm going to be able to vote for the first time this year. He'll be my first vote, and I'm proud to do it.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I'm glad to see somebody your age that recognizes those things because there's there's much more at stake when you're talking about the leader of the free world than if he makes mean tweets and stuff, and that's all of that is secondary. He did some amazing things as president, with Israel and with our foreign policy, Afghanistan. The first president since Reagan that didn't start a war.
And they all thought
He's
World War III was coming.
Yeah, yeah. So he will be the president unless they can figure out a way to steal it away from him through the court things that they're doing or in any other number of ways.
Right. And speaking of, the 2020 election and all the fraud that we clearly see went on, you've done a lot of work on election integrity. Can you tell us a little bit about that, what you've done to take action and what more you plan to do? And say, if you become governor, what will you do to continue that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The idea of verifying the election before you certify it seems really straightforward, and most people can relate to that. They call it a risk limiting audit. Basically, you just have someone that can come in and do some statistical analysis on a election and say, yeah, it seems like this was done correctly. And that should happen at the precinct level all the way up. And the fact that even suggesting that gets such backlash um, tells you that maybe somebody knows that there's something that they're hiding. Otherwise, they would say, "Yeah, let's do that. It's not terribly expensive." Um, and I'm not inclined to dwell on 2020, but I watched it. I watched it happen. I stayed up that night. I tell people I've been to some basketball games where this huge comeback. I've never seen it happen during halftime, and that's what we saw in the 2020. Is like you you shut down the election, you come back, it's like, oh, how did this happen? And no one can answer the question. In Utah, there's some precincts in Salt Lake that I did the analysis on. I have their voter rolls and I have the number of votes that were cast in that. And when you get 80% turnout in an election, that's really good. You get 100%, that's like unbelievable. You get 270% turnout in an election, it's like there's a problem here.
Right.
And all you have to do is it's like I didn't create these numbers. I just pulled these right off the state's information, and I'm presenting those, and all I get is, that I'm an election denier, and I'm a CPA. That's what I do. I do third party assurance. If somebody wants to get a loan from a bank, they come to me, and I look over their financials and say, and typically it's, a low level compilation level type review, and you look them over and you say, yeah, look these over, they look okay. And the bank says, good, then we'll rely on that assurance. And that's all we need in the elections, as well as is third party assurance. And beyond that, it ought to be voting on election day with the voter ID, paper ballots at the precinct level. If they want to call it a national holiday, or even two days, that would be a much better approach to the way we're doing our elections. And those that fight against it so vigorously, a lot of times you find out that they have ulterior motives.
Right. You'll hear the left and all of them say, January 6th, that was the attack on democracy. That was this and that. And I'm like, no, the 2020 election and the fraud that went on, that is an attack on our constitutional republic. We don't have that if we're selecting leaders. Well, if the people aren't selecting the leaders, if the higher ups
Yeah.
are. And so it's just so important. And, I was up late that night too, watching the election. And then I wake up in the morning. Well, I went to bed with Trump in the lead, then wake up and Biden somehow just shot up in like Michigan, Wisconsin, all those states. It was crazy.
And to put people in prison because they come to the Capitol to ask for a redress of grievances, and then put people in prison who just liked uh,
Yeah.
some things that they saw on Facebook. It's kangaroo court. This is like, Banana Republic stuff. We're not far away from, kind of the Gulag archipelago days of coming after people. I thought it was really funny the other day. President Biden condemned Putin for putting his political opponents in prison.
I
It's like,
saw.
oh well, yeah,
Yeah.
that doesn't seem like a very cool thing to do, but
Right. But
the irony of that is just, it just makes your head spin.
it's the definition of the whole Biden presidency so far.
Yeah,
Incompetency.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's sad. It really is. It really is sad what they've done to the country, and it's people like you that are going to, you know, fix it. It's not Congress. It's not legislatures. It's not governors. It's the people, and if they'll wake up, then things will change.
For sure. Now, on a little brighter note, for my last question for you, I just want to ask you, what is your message to Utah? If you could say anything just to the people of Utah, what would it be?
No, there's a lot of things, but I will say this: families are important. They are the bedrock of our society. Utah is number one in a lot of things economically, but we're number one because we have families, we have work ethic, we have people that, really care and support each other. And however you want to define family, I'm not trying to put anybody in a box that way, but I am really pleased when I see, young people that are willing to get married, have some babies, because it's a big deal. It's like starting a business, and I admire people that do that too. So my message to Utah is that we've got your back at the government level. We've got your back. We're going to try to keep things fair. We're going to try to keep things from being um, pushed over on you without your knowledge and to deceive you. People right now are seeing their property taxes go sky high, and they're looking at developments, you know, next door to them that have all this, local government money invested in the infrastructure, the stuff that they had to pay for themselves when they built their neighborhoods, um, and that's not fair. And it's really hard on families. So
Right.
and you see it. All that federal money that we take drives gas prices higher, drives food prices higher, house prices. We are one of the least affordable states for houses, and we're becoming I guess I would say, a family unfriendly state, and that's not Utah. That can never be Utah. So whatever we have to do to fix that, we've got to be a family friendly state.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And if you just want to let people know where they can find you on social media, stuff like that, and so they can go check you out, where would that be?
Yeah. go to Lyman for Utah. That's FOR, lymanforutah.com. And I've got my website up, and it's a work in progress. We're getting all the policies on there, but it's a really good website. Uh, lots of information, place there to volunteer or to donate, and I'd love to see this become a movement. And I think it's starting to do that. So
Great.
that's my hope.
Well, thank you. And then thank you so much for joining me today. And I just want you to know that in your considering to run for governor, and after that, I'd love to help in any way that I can. I think it's great the courage that you have to go up against an incumbent. That's hard because it's nearly impossible to win. You see the numbers in any race, state, local, federal, doesn't matter. So thank you for that.
Right. Yeah, it is an uphill climb. It's interesting. Every day we see some new development that, whether it's nationally or just here at home, that makes me feel like it's doable. It's possible.
For sure. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you, Chase, and thanks for doing this podcast and doing good work.